Classic Starts. Peter Pan. Chapter 1. Famous Last Words. All children grow up. All except one. Wendy learned this when she was playing in the garden one day at the age of 2. She brought her mother a flower, and Mrs. Darling hugged her and said, "Oh, why can't you stay like this forever and ever?" Before that day, Wendy didn't realize she wouldn't stay the same. Wendy had 2 younger brothers, John and Michael. They were growing, too. Mrs. Darling stayed home with the children, while Mr. Darling went to work in stocks. His stocks didn't always work for him, however, and so the family had to scrimp and save. They still had a nanny, of course, because all the other families in the neighborhood had one, and Mr. Darling cared very much about keeping up with the neighbors. But the Darlings were poor, and so their nanny was actually just a giant Newfoundland dog named Nana. Nana was an interesting nanny, to say the least. She didn't believe in all this newfangled talk about germs. Sometimes she would lovingly lick the children right after she licked her own foot. Mr. Darling was ashamed of Nana, and sometimes he was cold to her as a result. He shouldn't have been. She was actually quite a treasure. If the children wandered or dilly-dallied on their way to school, she would bump them with her big head to get them back on track. She never once forgot John's soccer uniform, and she usually carried an umbrella in her mouth, instead of a bone, in case of rain. And it did rain quite often in England. All in all, the Darlings were a normal, happy English family. Until, that is, the arrival of a boy named Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling had never heard of Peter Pan until one day when she was tidying up her children's minds. Most good mothers do this after their children are asleep, as if minds are drawers and children's memories are underwear and socks that need to be neatly folded and put away. Oh, how Mrs. Darling would wrinkle her forehead sometimes at the sweet things she found in her children's minds, wondering where on earth they had picked them up. These things, she would lay out and lovingly smooth on the bed for the children to slip on first thing in the morning. Other times, however, she found mean or ugly thoughts in her children's sleepy heads. These she would shake out and quickly hide, like something pushed under the bed. Children's minds are a curious place. If someone could draw a map, it would be full of zigzag lines and squiggles. Eventually, however, all the lines and squiggles would lead to Neverland. What is Neverland? You ask. It is the magical island in the middle of every child's mind. It is a place children go to mainly in their imaginations, unless of course they have an invitation and a very special guide. Every child's Neverland is slightly different. Some are in color and others are in black and white. Some have ragged coral reefs with tiny smashed-up boats, lonely caves, and tiny huts on the beach. Others have hunchbacked little old ladies, turtles laying eggs, or gnomes who like to sew. Others still have scary first days at school, trying not to laugh at church, pop quizzes on grammar that you haven't studied for, money from the tooth fairy, and chocolate pudding. There are no rules to what one's Neverland should be. John's Neverland had a lagoon with flamingos flying over it, while Michael, who tried hard to be like his older brother, had a flamingo with lagoons flying over it. Wendy, meanwhile, had a pet wolf and a boat. The island doesn't appear on any map, because it never stands still. If you can find it, Neverland is a very fun place to visit during the day when it's sunny. But in the 2 minutes before children go to bed, it becomes scary and full of shadows. That is why night lights were invented. Mrs. Darling didn't know anything about Neverland. Or rather, she did, from her own childhood. But she had long since forgotten, and so was confused when she bumped into the island in her travels through her children's minds. There were other things that confused her, too. For starters, there was the name Peter, which came up again and again, in bolder letters than any other word in all of her children's minds, especially Wendy's. "Who is this Peter?" she asked her daughter. "Is he a friend of yours?" Well, Wendy admitted, not always. You know I don't like you talking to strangers, Mrs. Darling said. But he isn't a stranger, Mother. Don't you remember him? Why, I've never heard of him in my life. Mrs. Darling insisted, but as soon as she said this, she knew it was not quite true. She could not remember meeting Peter, or ever knowing him. No, she was too old for that. But in the back of her mind she recalled a story about a boy who kept children company so that they would not be scared. She was sure that she had believed in him when she was Wendy's age. Well, anyway, even if I did remember him, by now he would be grown up, just like me, she said and tucked Wendy in for the night. I'm worried about this Peter person, Mrs. Darling told her husband later that evening. Don't be, he said. It's probably just some nonsense put into their heads by that no-good nanny. It will all blow over, wait and see. These are what are sometimes referred to as famous last words. Chapter 2, Now, Peter. Now. Children often find even the strangest events rather commonplace. For example, they might casually mention that when they were playing in the woods last Wednesday, they met a ghost and played tag with him on roller skates. It was in just this way that Wendy revealed something quite upsetting to her mother one morning. Mrs. Darling was tidying up the nursery where all of the young Darling children slept and discovered some leaves on the floor. She asked Wendy about them, but Wendy merely replied, "Oh, Peter must have left those leaves." What do you mean? Mrs. Darling asked nervously. He really is quite messy, said Wendy, who was a very tidy child. With a sigh, she explained that Peter often came to the nursery at night and sat at the foot of her bed, playing the flute. Sweetheart, Mrs. Darling assured her, the front door is locked at night. No one can get in. He comes in through the window, Wendy insisted. He can't possibly. We are 3 stories up. Why didn't you tell me this before? Her mother cried. I got hungry and forgot, said Wendy, who was now feeling rather hungry again. While Wendy went to look for a snack, Mrs. Darling stayed behind, still frowning about the leaves. The thing that scared her most was that she was fairly certain they were from a tree that did not even grow in England. She searched the room for other clues, but found none. You are making a fuss out of nothing at all, Mr. Darling insisted when she told him. Now come to bed. I suppose you are right, Mrs. Darling said. Only he wasn't. The very next night, she tucked the children in, went downstairs to sit by the warm fire and sew, and fell asleep. Almost immediately she started to dream. She dreamed that Neverland had drifted too close to the beach, and that a strange boy had jumped into the water and was swimming toward her children. Wendy, John, and Michael were on the shore, happily waving him in. This might have only been a silly dream were it not for the fact that, upstairs, the window of the children's bedroom had blown open and a boy really had flown in and dropped onto the floor. With him was a little light, no bigger than a fist, that darted around the room like a mosquito. Mrs. Darling woke with a start. She knew at once that the swimming boy was Peter Pan. She ran upstairs, threw open the door to the children's bedroom, and sure enough there he was. He was wearing clothes made of leaves, the same strange kind that he had left behind the last time. But the strangest thing about him was that although he must have been very old now, at least as old as she, he still seemed to have all of his baby teeth. When Peter saw Mrs. Darling, he bared those pearly little teeth at her and growled. Mrs. Darling screamed, and in a split second Nana was there. She growled, too, and lunged at Peter. He dodged her and jumped out the window. Mrs. Darling screamed again. After all, she didn't want the boy dead. She looked down but saw no broken body. Looking up, she saw what looked like a shooting star speeding away. When she turned, she saw that Nana had something in her mouth. It was Peter's shadow. Nana had nipped it with her teeth right before Peter jumped, and the shadow had snapped off. Nana wanted to hang the shadow out the window so Peter could come back and get it without bothering the children. But Mrs. Darling thought that it would look like laundry drying. Mr. Darling would be upset if the neighbors saw that. Instead, she decided to stuff the shadow into the bottom of a drawer, hidden away like one of her children's unpleasant thoughts. "That horrid dog," Mr. Darling said when she told him the next day what had happened. "She can't go around snapping off people's shadows left and right. Why, we'll be sued, based." Poor Nana. And poor Mr. Darling, too. He knew he was being awful and unfair, but he couldn't help it. He was frustrated and jealous about other people doing better in the stock market, and about the children loving Nana so very much, possibly more than him. It didn't help matters that Nana had brushed up against him yesterday, getting white hair all over his coat. "Go to the doghouse where you belong," he yelled at her. "George," Mrs. Darling whispered, "remember what I told you about that boy. What if he comes back and Nana's not here to guard the children?" But Mr. Darling would not listen. He was determined to show everyone who was the master of the house. And so out Nana went. That night, as Mrs. Darling was putting the children to bed and lighting their night lights, they heard Nana downstairs in the yard, barking. "Grit, she is just protesting being chained up," John said. Wendy was wiser, however. "No, that is how Nana barks when she smells danger," she said. Mrs. Darling shuddered. Outside, she saw a million stars, some of which seemed to her to be hovering around the house, as if trying to get in. Oh, how she wished that she and Mr. Darling did not have to go to a dinner party tonight. "Don't worry, Mama," Michael said. "Nothing can hurt us when our nightlights are lit, isn't that right?" This was something Mrs. Darling had told the children in the past, so she couldn't very well take it back now. "That's right," she said soothingly. "Nightlights are the eyes a mother leaves behind at night to watch over her babies." Besides, she told herself, she and Mr. Darling would be so close, only a few houses away. What could possibly happen? A few minutes later, Mr. and Mrs. Darling were outside, strolling arm in arm to their dinner party. But they were being observed from above. It was the stars, spying. The old stars were glassy-eyed and bored, but the little ones were curious and full of wonder and winks. They didn't particularly care for Peter, who liked to sneak up behind them and try to blow them out, but they were generally fond of fun, and Peter was all about fun, so they decided to help him tonight. The instant Mr. and Mrs. Darling were safely inside the neighbor's house, a commotion broke out in the heavens. A chorus of the smallest stars in the Milky Way cried out, "Now, Peter! Now!" Chapter 3, Acorn Kisses and Jealous Fairies. The night lights were still burning when Mr. and Mrs. Darling left the house. But even a night light gets tired sometimes. It is an awful lot of work, as you might imagine, trying to stay bright and shiny all the time. Wendy's light went out first. It yawned, and, yawns being contagious, the other two lights promptly yawned as well. Then, before any of the lights could close their mouths, all three went out from the resulting breeze. The children's room, however, was still not dark. A strange blinking glow came from within a water jug. Inside was a fairy, no bigger than your hand. Her name was Tinker Bell, and she was in the jug looking for Peter's shadow. Peter appeared next. "Tink," he called softly. "Is my shadow in that jug?" "No," Tink replied, emerging. When Tinker Bell spoke, it sounded like bells. It was a special fairy language that only Peter and his boys could understand. Tink told Peter that she had just spotted his shadow in the chest of drawers. Peter threw open the drawers, piling the clothes in a heap on the floor, and found his shadow. Grabbing it, he tried to slip it back on like a pair of pants, but it would not fit. He tried to put it on like a hat, but it jumped off his head. His shadow, it seemed, did not want him back. Peter sat on the floor and started to cry. His cries woke Wendy, and she sat up in bed. "Excuse me," she asked politely. "Who are you?" "I am Peter Pan," he said. Who are you? My name is Wendy, darling. I live here. I live second to the right, said Peter, and then straight on until morning. That's a funny address, Wendy said. I don't see what's so funny about it, Peter huffed, embarrassed. Well, what do people write on the envelope when they send you letters? Wendy asked. No one sends me letters, Peter said in a low voice. Now he was not only embarrassed, but sad, too, about his lack of letters. When your mother gets letters? Wendy tried weakly. Oh, I don't have a mother, Peter said in a normal voice. The funny address and the lack of letters had bothered him briefly, but mothers, he felt, were overrated. For Wendy, however, a funny address, no letters, and no mother seemed incredibly sad. Oh, Peter, no wonder you were crying, she said. She got out of bed and ran to hug him. I wasn't crying about not having a mother. He huffed. I was crying because I can't get my shadow back on. Do you have any glue? Wendy smiled. How exactly like a boy? You can't glue it back on, silly. It must be sewn on. I will do it for you. Got feeling very important, Wendy got her sewing kit. Within minutes, the shadow was back where it belonged, even if it was a bit wrinkly. Wendy wondered briefly whether she should have ironed it first. That yippee! Peter cried, twirling in front of the mirror. Look at me and my handsome shadow. A thank you might be nice, Wendy suggested. For what? Peter asked. This made Wendy so mad that she got back into bed and covered her face with the blankets until Peter apologized. I'll forgive you if you give me a kiss, Wendy said, turning her cheek to him. She was of the age when she was starting to think about kisses. Peter hesitated, confused. Finally, he dropped an acorn button into her hand. Realizing that Peter was not quite that age yet, and not wanting to embarrass him, Wendy politely thanked him and said that she would wear his kiss on a string around her neck. How old are you? She asked. I don't know, Peter said. I ran away on the very day I was born, after I heard my parents talking about what I would be when I grew up. Why? Wendy asked. I didn't want to grow up, Peter said simply. Now I live with the lost boys and the fairies. Fairies? Wendy breathed, wide-eyed. Immediately she began to ask Peter everything she could think to ask about fairies. You see, Peter explained, when the very first baby laughed for the very first time, its laugh broke into 1,000,000 pieces. Each piece then became a fairy. Boy, this talk of fairies suddenly reminded Peter of Tinker Bell, who was being awfully quiet. He rose to look for her. Wendy jumped up, excited. Do you mean to say there is an actual fairy in this room? They both listened for her, but all Wendy could hear was the tinkle of bells. That's Tink. That's fairy language. Peter frowned. And it seems to be coming from inside that chest of drawers. Suddenly Peter laughed. He realized he had locked Tinker Bell in the drawer. She must have flown in when he reached for his shadow. Oh, how she screamed when he let her out. Tink, he said, watching her fly around the room in a fury, such language. What's she saying? Wendy asked, watching the angry blur. I do wish she would stand still so I could see her. Will she be my fairy? Tink, Peter said. Stand still for a second, would you? Wendy wants to see you, and for you to be her fairy. Tinker Bell clinked something angry in reply. She says you are a huge ugly girl, and she can't be your fairy because she is my fairy. Well, Wendy huffed. She is not very polite. Peter had to agree. Since Tinker Bell wasn't cooperating, Wendy turned her attention back to Peter. She had so many more questions for him. He told her all about the lost boys who had fallen out of their strollers when they were babies and had never been claimed. "I'm their captain," he said. "What fun!" Wendy replied. "But are there no girls on the island?" "Oh, no," Peter replied. "Girls are too smart to fall out of their strollers." "What a nice thing to say," Wendy replied, blushing. Suddenly Wendy screamed. It felt as if someone had pulled her hair. "That must be Tink," Peter explained. "She certainly is being naughty today." Tinker Bell told Peter that she would continue to misbehave so long as Peter kept being nice to Wendy. Just like Mr. Darling, it seemed that the little fairy suffered from one enormous case of jealousy. Chapter 4. The Birds Leave the Nest. "Peter," Wendy said, "why did you come to the nursery?" "To hear the story your mother was telling," Peter replied. Wendy was a bit disappointed to learn that he had not come for her, but she asked, "Which story was it?" "It was the story about the lady who lost her glass slipper. But I had to leave, and I missed the ending." "That's Cinderella," Wendy said. "I can tell you how it ends. The prince finds her, and they live happily ever after." Peter turned to the window. "Wait, where are you going?" Wendy asked. "Back to Neverland to tell the other boys." Peter replied. "Don't go," Wendy begged. "I know lots of other stories, even better than that one, Ed." "Well, then, come on," he said, dragging her. "We'll fly back together. You can tell the stories to the lost boys." "Let go of me!" Wendy cried. She was very flattered to be asked, of course, but she couldn't leave her poor mother. Besides, she couldn't fly. "I'll teach you," Peter said. Wendy had always wanted to learn how to fly. "Think how much the lost boys will love you," Peter continued. "You could be a sort of mother to them. You could even tuck them in. None of them has ever been tucked in before." This was too much for Wendy to resist. She did have very strong maternal feelings. "What about John and Michael?" she asked. "If I leave them, they will be lost boys in a way as well. They can come. I'll teach them to fly, too." At this, the boys jumped out of bed. They had been listening quietly the entire time, not letting on that they were really awake. But at the thought of flying, they could no longer stay still. Suddenly Peter spun around. "Shoo," he said. His eyes narrowed. "Listen. Do you hear that?" Wendy didn't hear anything. "Exactly," Peter said. Nana, sensing his presence, had been barking since Peter had entered the nursery. Now she was oddly quiet. "There can be only one explanation," John said. "She's broken her chain and is running up here. I want to learn how to fly, and Nana's going to ruin everything." "Bad, pretend to be sleeping," Peter instructed. "Tink and I will hide." And so it was that Liza, the family cook, saw the children resting peacefully when she entered with the very excited Nana. Liza had finally had enough of Nana's barking and thought the best way to ease the dog's mind would be to bring her upstairs and show her that the children were fine. "I told you so," she whispered to Nana. "They are all safe and sound." "Silly dog." Nana was still suspicious, but Liza would have no more of it. She dragged Nana downstairs and chained her up again. What else could Nana do? She strained and strained at her chain until it finally broke. Then she ran over to where Mr. and Mrs. Darling were dining and burst into the house, barking for help. Even Mr. Darling realized at once that something must be seriously wrong at home. Thanking their hosts, he and Mrs. Darling rushed out. But it had been 10 minutes since Nana had been in the nursery, and Peter Pan could do a lot in 10 minutes. "You simply think wonderful thoughts," Peter explained, "and they lift you up in the air." The children tried and tried, thinking the happiest thoughts they could, but still they could not rise from their beds. Of course, Peter was not telling them the whole truth. No one can fly unless some fairy dust has been blown on them. Tinker Bell was still being uncooperative, but Peter had some dust on his hands from holding her earlier. He blew a bit on each of the children and they flew. Wouldn't you know it? Oh, how they laughed as they sailed clumsily around their room. Watch out! Michael cried as he narrowly missed crashing into his brother by the bathroom. Let's go outside, John said. Belle, I'm going to fly for 1,000,000 miles. Michael said. Wendy frowned. It suddenly all seemed a bit too real and risky now that her brothers were involved. But the sly Peter knew how to make her come along. Did I tell you about the mermaids? He said. Mermaids? Wendy breathed. Mermaids were even more exciting than fairies. And pirates, Peter added. Let's go at once, said John. Mr. and Mrs. Darling were almost home, but they were not close enough. From the middle of the street, they gasped as they looked up at the bedroom window. Beyond the curtain, the room was ablaze with light. Inside they could see 3 little shadows whirling around and around, not on the floor but, incredibly, in the air. No, not 3 figures but 4. The stars, still watching from up above, called out a warning. Peter! The grown-ups are coming back. There was no time to lose. Peter threw open the window. Come on, he cried, soaring into the night. John, Michael, and Wendy followed. Still on the street, Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana watched in horror as their 3 little birds left the nest and were gone. Chapter 5. The Long Flight. Second to the right, and then straight on until morning. Wendy remembered what Peter had said, but it seemed that even birds carrying street maps and consulting them at windy corners couldn't have found Neverland with those directions. And so Michael and Wendy and John had no choice but to follow Peter and to trust him completely. He led them around in circles, flying past church spires and clock towers and any other tall object that struck his fancy. John and Michael didn't mind. They were having too much fun flying over the ocean, racing each other between waves. Wendy, however, was worried. It seemed to her that they had been flying for days now. Was the island called Neverland because they would never land? It certainly seemed a possibility. She was relieved, at least, that Peter was feeding them, although his way of doing so was rather strange. He would chase birds that had food in their mouths and steal it. The birds would then steal it back. And so it went like this for a while, until someone managed to gobble the food down. Worst of all, the children were getting incredibly sleepy. Occasionally, one of them would fall asleep while flying and drop like a heavy stone toward the cruel sea below. It always turned out all right. Either the other children would shout, "Wake up," or Peter would swoop down at the last minute to save the falling child, but they each came awfully close to the water a few times. One of these days, Wendy thought, Peter might let them fall just for the fun of it, because it would be an interesting sight to see. Don't make him mad, Wendy whispered to John. What would we do if he left us? We would go back, John said. We don't know the way. Well, then, we would go on, said John. We don't know that way, either. In fact, we don't even know how to stop flying. John thought about this. Wendy was right. Peter had never shown them how to stop. Well, he said, worst comes to worst, we could always just keep going. The world is round, after all. Eventually, we would get back to our bedroom window, don't you think? Peter was nowhere to be found. It wasn't uncommon for him to leave them occasionally. Easily bored and distracted, he would fly up high to talk to the stars, or down low to talk with a mermaid. He always came back, but sometimes he seemed barely to remember them, as if he had already moved on to his next adventure. I'm Wendy. Wendy had reminded him once when he had flown back and looked at her blankly. I know that, Peter had said, but she could tell he was lying. Eventually, the children learned how to fall asleep without falling. Peter, however, found this boring, so he would cry out and wake them up anyway just to see them jump. At last they reached Neverland, less due to Peter's guidance, it seemed to Wendy, than through sheer luck, or perhaps because the island had been looking for them. There it is, Peter said. He gestured in the direction the sun was shining, like 100 golden arrows pointing to the island. Look, there's the coral reef and the tiny hut. And the cave, cried John. And my lagoon with the flying flamingos. And there's the hunchbacked little old lady and the turtles laying their eggs and the sewing gnomes. Michael added. And my flamingo with the flying lagoons. Hello, Wolfie, Wendy called down to her pet wolf. Hello, boat. The children also saw and recognized the scary first days at school, trying not to laugh at church, the pop quizzes they hadn't studied for, the tooth fairy money, and the delicious chocolate pudding. It was all so familiar. Peter was a little annoyed with the children for knowing so much about the island. He wanted to be the one who knew everything. Shortly, however, the sun went down and the children got scared. Then Peter felt better because they needed him again. Down below, black shadows grew and strange noises could be heard. Out in the open sky, there were no nightlights or nanas to keep a child safe. The children were on their own. Huddling close to Peter, they flew so low now that their toes occasionally brushed the ocean. Something strange hung in the air. All of them could sense it. They don't want us to land, Peter said. Who are they? Wendy whispered, shuddering. Peter wouldn't say. Instead he said, this island is full of pirates, and their captain, Hook, is the biggest pirate of all. The boys had been excited about the pirates, but at the reality of them Michael began to cry, and even John gulped. Of course, Hook's not quite as big as he used to be, Peter added, thanks to me. During our last battle, I chopped off his right hand with my sword. Now he has an iron claw instead of fingers. If you meet him, you leave him to me, got it? Yes. Don't say yes. Say I, sir. Every boy who serves under me has to say that. But I, sir, John replied. It occurred to John then that Tinker Bell's light might make it easier for the pirates to see them. Tell her to go away at once, Peter, the children cried, but he refused. She gets scared and lonely, too, he said. They compromised. John would carry Tink in his hat, which he would hold in his hand. This worked for a while until John got tired and Wendy took over. Don't think that this changes anything between us, the still jealous Tink clinked, if only for Peter's benefit. Suddenly the quiet black sky was split in two by a loud boom. The noise echoed through the dark mountains. It's their cannon! John cried. The pirates have fired it at us. Is anyone shot? I'm not, Michael said. But wait, where were Peter and Wendy? The wind from the cannon fire had carried Peter far out to sea, and Wendy and Tink blew high up into the black sky. Tink wasn't all bad, but fairies are so small that they only have room for one feeling at a time. When she was around Wendy, the jealousy Tink felt could barely fit. Seeing a chance to rid herself of Wendy, Tink gestured for the girl to follow her. What else could Wendy do, all alone in the sky? She flew trustingly after the fairy to meet her fate. Chapter 6. Island Come True. As though it were a living, breathing thing, Neverland seemed to sense that Peter was almost home. Like a puppy, it strained and wiggled to meet him at the door. Whenever Peter went away, the island slowed. The fairies slept late. The wild animals nursed their babies. The pirates and the Lost Boys and the Indians stopped fighting wars and just called one another names instead. With his return, however, the whole place started to rumble as if a train were coming. The lost boys set out to find Peter. The pirates started looking for the lost boys, the Indians began looking for the pirates, and the wild animals started looking for the Indians. All of them went around and around the island, but at the same speed, so they never met. Let us take a moment to examine each group as it passes. The first to come our way are the lost boys. The number of lost boys varies. If someone grows up, which is against the rules, he is kicked out. Right now, there are 6. They wear bearskins and carry daggers, and they creep through the bushes like soldiers in single file. Leading the group is Toodles. Toodles has bad luck. The biggest adventures always seem to happen whenever he steps around the corner for a snack. When he returns, he inevitably finds the boys putting on bandages after a brilliant and bloody fight. He could be bitter about it, but Toodles is the sweetest and humblest lost boy. Next comes Nibs, the best dressed of the lost boys, followed by Slightly, who can carve whistles out of wood and dances to his own tunes. Slightly is also the most arrogant lost boy. He sticks up his nose at everyone so much that sometimes you can see right up inside. Curly is the 4th boy. He is always getting into trouble, and he has grown accustomed to taking the blame even for things he didn't do. Last are the twins. We will not describe them because no one can ever tell them apart anyway. Instead, let's move on to the pirates, close behind, on the boys' trail. They are a scary-looking bunch. Leading their ragged group is the handsome Italian pirate Secco, who carved his name in blood on the back of the warden of the prison from which he had escaped. Behind him is the giant, tattooed Bill Jukes, who once took 6 bullets before dropping the bag of gold pieces he'd been stealing. Next are Cookson and Gentleman Starkey. Starkey is the most polite of the pirates. He always apologizes before stabbing anyone with his sword. Then come the Irish pirate, Smee, and Noodler, followed by a few more ruffians. Somewhere in the middle of this dark and dangerous group is James Hook, the most feared pirate of them all. His hair is styled in long, shiny black curls, framing a sternly handsome face. His eyes are deep and black and dead unless he is plunging his hook into someone, in which case his eyes sparkle a bright and happy red. Hook is a different breed of pirate from the rest of his crew. Except at the sight of his own blood, he is courageous. He is a master storyteller. He speaks beautifully and softly even when he is swearing and is never more sinister than when he is being polite. After the pirates come the Indians. Creeping quietly like shadows, they carry tomahawks and knives. Among them is Tiger Lily, the beautiful Indian princess, whom none dare approach for fear that she will raise her hatchet to them. Behind the Indians creep the beasts lions, tigers, bears, and other animals. The beasts are so hungry that their tongues are hanging out. Or finally, there comes a giant crocodile. He is hungry, too, but not for just any meat. No, he has a craving for something or, rather, someone very specific. The boys stop first. They are getting tired. I wish Peter would get home already and tell us how Cinderella ends, Slightly said, out of breath. Toodles was about to respond when the boys heard the pirates walking and singing in the distance. The lost boys had stopped, but the pirates were still coming. Peter had trained the boys well, and they knew exactly what to do. In a flash they each ran to a nearby tree. Instead of climbing up, however, the boys went down. The trees were hollow, each with a hole in it exactly as big as one of the boys, and all leading to the same underground cave. Hook had heard about these tree doors, and thought it silly that each boy had his own tree. For his purposes, however, it suited him just fine. 7 trees should be easier to find than 1. The pirates soon arrived in the clearing where the lost boys had just been. While the others fanned out to continue their search, Hook and Smee stayed behind. I think I spotted that Nibs boy, Captain, Smee said. Shall I run after him? I could tickle him with my sword. No, Hook said. I want them all, especially their captain, Peter Pan. He cut off my arm and threw it to a passing crocodile. His waved his iron claw in the air. One of these days, I'm going to shake his hand with this. Is that why you fear crocodiles? Smee asked. Not all crocodiles, Hook replied. Just that one. It thought my arm was so tasty that it has followed me ever since, licking its lips, just waiting to eat the rest of me. The only reason it has not caught me yet is that it swallowed a clock, which ticks inside it. I always hear the beast coming and run away. One day, that clock's battery will die, Smee pointed out. The ticking will stop. Hook agreed darkly, sitting down on a mushroom. It was a strangely warm mushroom, Hook thought. Standing up, he pulled at the mushroom and discovered that its top easily came off. The headless mushroom then started to smoke. Why, it wasn't